This is Lesson 11.5, Social Unrest in a Changing Society. So what explains the social unrest of the late Middle Ages? Places: Flanders, France, England, Italy, and Ireland. Time frame: about the 1320s to about 1400. Key people of social unrest in a changing society: Dante, Wat Tyler, John Ball, Richard II of England, and Geoffrey Chaucer. Key concepts of social unrest in a changing society: the Jacquerie, 1358, fur collar crime, the Chiampi Revolt, 1378, the Statutes of Kilkenny, the English Peasants Revolt of 1381. Here's the big takeaway from this lesson, and really all of these lessons that are in this particular unit. One of the big misperceptions that we have about the Middle Ages is that nothing much was going on for 1,000 years, and then the Renaissance swept in and suddenly changed everything. But as we have seen in these lessons, there was actually a lot going on. There was a lot of change happening, much of which was already laying the groundwork, not only for the coming Renaissance, but for the entire modern age as well. During the 100 Years' War, both sides of the war experienced peasant revolts. There had been peasant revolts earlier in the High Middle Ages, but these late Middle Ages revolts were more frequent, more intense, more widely distributed, and these peasant revolts were both urban and rural. Peasant revolts often included more than just peasants. They could include townspeople, even knights and other nobles, renegade clergy, artisans, merchants. But we still call them peasant revolts. Most who took part were peasants. In fact, witnesses were often struck and unnerved by the number of peasants involved, and the goals of these revolts tended to reflect peasant concerns. There were 4 major peasant revolts that we will look at: Flanders in the 1320s, the Jacquerie in France in 1358, the English Peasants Revolt, 1381, and the Chiampi in Florence, 1378. Let's begin with Flanders. Flanders was in present-day Belgium, and the people of Flanders were under French rule and resented paying taxes to the French. Monasteries were also charging the peasants more than the normal tithes. Monasteries were a source of frustration and controversy practically everywhere, as we have seen. We saw that in the last lesson with John Wickliffe's criticism of them. Flemish peasant rebels burned aristocratic castles and manors. The French army brutally crushed the rebellion. Then the French punished the people of Flanders economically for years thereafter. And we've seen how the people of Flanders really wanted England to go to war with France in our 100 Years' War lesson. The Jacquerie in France, 1358. We've talked about how the 100 Years' War was going very badly for France during its first phase, starting in 1337. The French people were paying higher taxes because of the war, and marauding English were tearing up the countryside in their chevauchés. The French had lost a huge battle at Poitiers, and the king, Richard II, and his son were both captured. And the nobles were expecting the peasants to pay for their incompetence by paying for the king's ransom to the English. And Jacques was sick of it. So who exactly is this Jacques? Well, you're Jacques, and I'm Jacques. All of us poor, hard-working people who are oppressed by the nobles and their poor handling of this war are Jacques. Their supposed leader was a mythical character named Jacques Bonhomme, good man. Bonhomme means good man. But even his name sounds fictitious. Today we might say Jacques is John Q. Public or the man on the street. The sordid details of the Jacquerie. Rebels swept through the countryside for several weeks. They killed nobles and abused their families. They burned castles. They destroyed all kinds of property. Then the nobles recovered their advantage. They crushed the Jacquerie without mercy, and thousands of Jacques were killed. Then we have the English Peasants Revolt, 1381. Here's the background. We've already mentioned John Wicklife's supposed role in the English Peasants Revolt. Both the Black Death and the 100 Years' War set the stage for this revolt. The Black Death had caused massive depopulation, and with labor in short supply, workers were making much higher wages. We talked about that with the Black Death lesson. So English lords passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This statute attempted to roll wages back to 1346 pre-plague levels, a lot lower than they currently were. And wage earners very much resented these laws. They felt they should be able to take advantage of the new demographic situation. Why shouldn't the working man reap the benefits of mass death? Such laws as the Statute of Laborers were bothersome for workers. The government couldn't realistically drive wages back to what they had been in 1346, but wage earners were prosecuted for accepting higher wages. Lords and nobles also attempted to reimpose serfdom. In other words, taking legally free peasants and making them unfree peasants. Remember that serfs were basically part-time property and had to work for their lords for part of the week for free. Serfs could be bought and sold along with the land they rented or sometimes owned. Serfs were not allowed to leave the manor they lived on. In some places, serfs could even be traded to pay off their lord's gambling debts, for example. So serfs were unable to take advantage of higher wages. Obligations of a serf, depending on the local laws and customs. Serfs often had to pay their lords an annual rent. Their lords could demand additional payments as well. Serfs could be beaten or whipped. Lords could dictate who married whom. They could force serfs to work in other manorial workshops. Lords could make serfs assist in hunts. They had to repair their lord's buildings. They had to carry messages for their lord. They had to do other menial tasks. They had to provide draft animals to their lord. The serf's wife might have to spin wool for the lord's family. Serf children might have to guard the lord's livestock. Children might have to serve in the manor house. A serf might have to provide produce to his lord, eggs, nuts, vegetables, even wood, etc. A serf might have to pay a tithe to the local priest or pastor. The state could also impose further obligations on serfs, making serfs keep roads and bridges in order, making serfs pay heavy taxes, making serfs provide horses for messengers, making younger men available for military service. Serfs also had very few rights. Serfs were often only allowed to buy things like salt, fish, or alcohol from their lords. They had to bring their grain to the lord's mill for grinding. Only the lords were allowed to hunt, and this deprived serfs of a source of food and clothing. Hunting also damaged their crops. Wild animals were allowed to roam all over their land, and serfs were often not allowed to put up fences. Noble hunts could charge right through their fields and trample on their crops. They often had to feed their lords hunting dogs and keep their own dogs chained up. Lords had a monopoly over fishing rights in local rivers and streams, and only lords could own pigeons. These rights and restrictions were often enforced in manorial courts, where the lords sat in judgment over their own serfs, and these manorial courts were often underwritten by the state. The lord's court power was enforced by the lord's own servants, and many lords had their own jails. But what really sparked the English Peasants Revolt of 1381 was royal taxation. As of 1381, the 100 Years' War had been going badly for England for a long time. Now the French had the upper hand and had been attacking English towns along the coast ever since 1369. This created a sense of near panic in the southeast of England. There were English fears of an all-out French invasion. There was deep resentment over having to pay increased taxes for a war that was not going well. Royal taxation was becoming a regularity in England, and peasants still had to pay dues to local lords and nobles. So English peasants were getting squeezed like never before. In 1377, the English crown imposed a poll tax on every English adult, male and female. All of it was to go to the war effort. It happened again in 1379, and then it happened a third time in 1380, but this time it was at 3 times the 1379 tax rate. So on May 31st, 1381, a group of peasants in the county of Essex rose up against some royal tax collectors who were trying to collect the poll tax of 1380. And these tax collectors were attacked and killed, and this touched off the English Peasants Revolt, which would last much of the summer of 1381. The vast majority of the revolt was in the southeast of England, and that was the most prosperous part of England, so these were not the poorest peasants who revolted. Similar uprisings took place throughout the southeast of England. There were several popular targets for attack: tax collectors, royal officials, wherever they could find them, lords and nobles, wherever they could find them, monasteries. Antimonasticism was strong. Why should monasteries exist? You have to pay them tithes. They use your tithes to buy lots of property and get rich. They supposedly pray all day, but they give nothing tangible back in return. Another big target was court records. Records that recorded taxes that each peasant owed to the king, and records of lords and monasteries that recorded dues and tithes owed by peasants. Peasants wanted to burn these records. We will see this happen again during the French Revolution. The peasant army grew very large over the summer. It numbered in the tens of thousands, and they approached the city of London itself. The citizens of London opened the city's gates in fear of the rebels, and the rebels started killing royal officials and lawyers on sight and destroying government records. But they didn't want to kill the king. The rebels had several very mysterious leaders. The most important leader was a mysterious person named Wat Tyler. We know practically nothing about his background before the revolt. Another leader was Jack Straw. He was so shadowy that historians aren't sure he really existed. Another really important leader was John Ball. He was a renegade priest. I love that, a renegade priest. He was actually in prison when the revolt started. He was in and out of prison a lot. He had lots of unorthodox ideas, and the Archbishop of Canterbury locked him up a lot to keep him from spreading these ideas. The peasants took over Canterbury. They freed John Ball, and John Ball started preaching these passionate, fiery sermons to the peasants. He added a radical streak to the peasant revolt of 1381. His slogan was, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" John Ball didn't invent this slogan, he just used it a lot. And it had an ominous meaning at the time. The idea was this: when Adam and Eve were the only people on the earth, and they did all the work themselves, who were the nobility? Who was lording it over them? No one. So the idea behind this phrase was all social distinctions were unnatural, unnecessary, and should be done away with. John Ball seems to have advocated killing the lords and nobles and lawyers of England as a good place to start. John Ball preached for a radical restructuring of the English church. Let's do away with the entire upper level of the church hierarchy. There should be only one bishop in all of England. The rest are unnecessary. Fire them. All monasteries should be abolished and dissolved, except for two that John Ball just happened to like. All the property held by these monasteries and bishops should be liquidated and distributed among the laity. Now that John Ball was in the peasant army, his ideas were getting a lot of support. And now we start to see why John Wickliffe had fingers pointed at him for starting the Peasants' Revolt. These peasants look really mean and nasty and angry. The King of England, Richard II, was only 14 years old. He sent messages to the rebels asking why they were rebelling and what they wanted. They answered by saying that they didn't really want to hurt the king. They wanted to save the king from his treacherous advisors. During the 13th and 14th of June, the peasants had a group of ambassadors present their demands to the 14-year-old king. They wanted certain royal officials handed over to them as traitors. They wanted the king to abolish all serfdom in the kingdom. And they wanted amnesty for themselves, pardons for all actions taken during the revolt. King Richard II was somewhat open to their demands. The uprising had taken him by surprise. He had not yet had time to marshal his forces. He abolished serfdom in some counties. He began to draw up acts of pardon for the rebels. The rebels began to disperse. They felt they had won the day. They felt the king was on their side. But on the second day of talks, other rebels continued their attacks. They killed Simon Sudbury, who was both royal chancellor and the Archbishop of Canterbury, a statistically very dangerous job, as we see. On the 15th, King Richard II met with Wat Tyler himself. Wat Tyler issued even more demands. Peasants should get more access to woodlands. They should have the right to hunt. Repeal the statute of laborers. All individuals in England should be raised to the rank of lord. All clergy should be stripped of their property. Property was to be sold and distributed to the laity, and there should be only one bishop in all of England. You can see the influence that John Ball had on Wat Tyler. What happened next is not fully understood by historians. Apparently, some of the king's officials were so outraged by Wat Tyler's demands and by his tone that they killed him right then and there. The peasants, seeing their leader killed, began to flee in panic. The English Peasants Revolt began to disintegrate, leaving the internet full of every picture of Wat Tyler being killed you could ever want. There were a few sporadic uprisings over the summer, but for the royal government, it was really a mop-up operation. They rounded up rebels everywhere. They hanged hundreds, including John Ball. All royal pardons were revoked. The king went back on all the concessions he had made. Urban conflicts. Let's look at the Chiampi in the city of Florence. In post-plague Europe, relations between merchants and artisans became more and more tense. Merchants and artisans differed a lot. Merchants didn't work with their hands like artisans did. Merchants were wealthier than artisans. Merchants' children married other merchants' children, not artisans' children. So they lived in different social circles. We've seen how the Black Death benefited wage earners in general. But many craftsmen, artisans, who depended on large markets suffered economically. And that tends to happen when so many of your customers are dead. Merchants stepped in to take advantage of that situation. Merchants liked to buy out artisans. An artisan might be financially strapped. A merchant would come in, buy his shop, and buy his tools, and then the merchant would hire that artisan back as a wage laborer. Before this, an artisan could pick and choose which merchant would get to sell his products. Now, the artisan worked for the merchant, and this put the artisan in a weak bargaining position. Merchants also used this situation to weaken the guild systems of late medieval towns. Guilds were economic organizations that governed all kinds of manufacturing activities within towns. We will hear much more about them throughout our course. One of their purposes was to reduce competition among producers of goods, in other words, artisans. Guilds closely regulated factors like what artisans produced, how they produced it, what tools they used, what raw materials they used. Merchants didn't care for guilds. Merchants were not concerned about all artisans being able to make a living. They were concerned with maximizing their own profits. They were always looking for new ways to produce goods and cheaper ways to produce goods. And that went directly against all the things that guilds stood for. More and more merchants were starting to get around guilds. One way of doing this was what we call the putting out system, and we will hear much more about this system next semester. For now, know that merchants could get their hands on capital, in other words, investment money, and they could use that money to buy up raw materials like wool. Then they could auction these raw materials to the lowest bidder, in other words, the producer who would turn these raw materials into finished goods for the lowest price. Merchants tended to favor rural producers. These were freelance peasants who did some manufacturing on the side when they weren't farming. These countryside people were outside the jurisdiction of guilds, and this weakened the economic situation of guild artisans in the towns. There were also problems within guilds. You had different social levels within these guilds. The master artisans were at the top. They owned their own shops. They had the rights to produce goods. Below that, you had journeymen. These were what you'd call masters in training. They often traveled from town to town. They worked for masters, and they would wait for an opening to occur somewhere so that they could rise to the level of master. Below them, you had apprentices. These made very little wages, but worked for the master, also hoping to become one someday. Masters protected themselves from the journeymen and the apprentices. They made it harder and harder to become a master. They created longer time requirements to become a master. They raised the fees you had to pay to the guilds. So just as the artisans resented the merchants, journeymen and apprentices also resented the masters. And these tensions could be so high that it wouldn't take much to touch off an urban uprising. The Chiampi of Florence were unskilled laborers, and a revolt that took place in Florence in 1378 was named after them. We'll hear more about the Chiampi in our Renaissance chapter. All of the cloth workers in Florence were put in one single super guild, and this was unique to Florence. It was run exclusively by merchants who were in the cloth industry. Workers such as dyers and weavers were forbidden from forming guilds of their own. In June 1378, the Chiampi revolted against the government. They burned down wealthy merchants' houses, they killed some of the foreign workers, and the city of Florence basically shut down economically. By July, the Chiampi took over the government and appointed one of their own as the new head of that government. The Chiampi started to create low-level guilds. It was highly unusual for wage laborers to seize control of the government. The Chiampi revolt didn't last that long in Florence. The revolt depended on a coalition among all the cloth worker levels, from unskilled wage laborers all the way up to the master artisans. And this was a hard alliance to maintain for reasons that we've already seen. By August of 1378, the Chiampi, the lowest of all low-level workers, were fighting in the streets against their fellow cloth workers. The Chiampi were defeated, disbanded, and they lost their own guild that they had created for themselves. But the Chiampi did create two other guilds that managed to stay in power for a while longer, although these also lost power in 1382. So the bottom line is, the Chiampi made it possible for the workers to control Florence for 4 years. The Jacquerie and the English Peasants Revolt both ended brutally. But the Chiampi Revolt did not end brutally. There was no period of bloody repression, and very few people were killed. And this suggests that people found peasant revolts much more disturbing than urban workers' revolts. Fur collar crime. What does the fighting nobleman do, the knight, when there's no fighting going on? The 100 Years' War saw many slowdowns and truces, but knights still had to have some kind of income even during those slow periods. Knights still had a lavish lifestyle to maintain, including nice expensive clothes with fur collars. If you were a knight, you basically had no choice but to prey upon the weak and the defenseless. Luckily, there were lots of ways to do that. This could involve professional violence, kidnapping for ransom, banditry, extortion. This could involve fraud, inflating taxes, charging extra fees. This could involve obstructing justice, intimidating witnesses, threatening jurors, giving bribes. All of this was extremely disruptive and destructive to society. Eventually, something would have to be done about these armed and dangerous aristocrats. More on that later. Ethnic tensions and restrictions. Migration is a topic we will be returning to again and again right up to the AP exam. There was a surprising amount of migration from one country to another during the late Middle Ages. English into Scotland and Ireland, Germans and French into Poland, Bohemia and Hungary, Christians into Muslim Spain. Growing towns saw a lot of people moving in. Towns saw more long-distance migration than the surrounding rural areas did. Why would you relocate hundreds of miles just to do more farming? Therefore, towns tended to have a lot of people in them who were ethnically different from the people living in the surrounding countryside. The spoken languages in towns often differed from the languages in the surrounding countryside. So you often had German spoken in Eastern European towns, or French spoken in Irish towns, etc. Because of this, different ethnic groups tended to live on top of each other in an ethnic hodgepodge rather than occupying their own exclusive areas. And this will become very important and have huge ramifications later. Plurality of customs was the norm. For example, ethnic Germans living in Poland tended to be judged according to German laws and customs. Muslim subjects of Christian kings tended to have the right to be judged in a Muslim court. But this norm changed over time, and the dominant ethnic groups started to take exclusive control over laws and institutions where they were. This way, they could bar access to the courts and institutional jobs for the minorities they didn't like. This idea of ethnic purity became a thing. Marriage laws were developed to maintain this sense of ethnic purity. Ethnic discrimination kept the wrong people out of church leadership, guild membership, and other appointments. A prime example of an ethnic purity law was the Statutes of Kilkenny from 1366. England basically had vast, what we would call colonies in Ireland, although they didn't use the term at that time. Many English lords had settled in these areas permanently, and these Anglo-Irish lords were beginning to go native, taking on Irish ways and Irish views. And King Richard III complained that these Anglo-Irish lords had become more Irish than the Irish themselves. And so these statutes had very serious penalties. The Statutes of Kilkenny were aimed at keeping these Anglo-Irish lords English. And these statutes made it against the law for these Anglo-Irish lords to do such things as marry an Irish person, adopt an Irish child, use an Irish name, wear Irish clothes, speak the Irish language, play Irish music, listen to Irish storytellers, play Irish games, let an Irish person join an English church, appoint any Irish clergyman to any church in the English settlement, or ride a horse in Irish style, that is, without a saddle. Because the English government was weak from the plague, they were not able to enforce the Statutes of Kilkenny, and the Anglo-Irish mostly ignored these statutes. Having the right blood in you. Hermione told Harry Potter that he had Quidditch in his blood. What were you called if you had Muggles in your family tree? In the movie Stand and Deliver, teacher Jaime Escalante told his Hispanic students that they had math in their blood because the Maya had been advanced in mathematics. Where do we get this idea of having certain qualities and characteristics in our blood? Two things we have studied were happening in the late Middle Ages. These migrations were causing people with diverse backgrounds to live much closer to each other's communities. The 100 Years' War was producing an emerging national consciousness, and commentators began describing ethnic characteristics in terms of blood. You could have national blood, you could have French blood, or English blood, etc. You could have religious blood. You might have Christian blood, Muslim blood, Jewish blood. You could have social class blood. You could be of noble blood or common blood. Not to mention racial blood. Wait till Europeans start exploring the globe in a couple of chapters. You could have African blood. You could have Asian blood. This way of thinking had powerful implications. You can change many things about yourself, your location, your language and customs, your religion and traditions, your job, even your career. But you can't change your blood. The blood you have stays with you from generation to generation, unscientifically speaking, of course. So whatever characteristics are perceived to be carried in your blood will be perceived as fixed and forever. And this is going to have big ramifications later on. We're still dealing with this mentality to this day. In the 1970s, there was a famous episode of the TV show MASH where a patient needed blood, and he told his doctors to be sure that any blood he got be the right color. At the end of the episode, we had a happy ending. He saw the error of his ways and gave a black officer a salute. Literacy and vernacular literature. First of all, what is the vernacular? The vernacular refers to the language that you're used to speaking. It's the language you grew up with, and the language you use to communicate with your friends and your family. So, for most of us, English would be our vernacular. If you're Spanish, Spanish is your vernacular. If you're German, German is your vernacular, and so on. And obviously, Latin and Greek, the main languages of literature during the Middle Ages, nobody's vernacular. Literacy and vernacular literature go hand in hand. Both certainly got a big boost from two huge developments, the printing press and the Renaissance. But let's not overstate this. In fact, literacy and vernacular literature were starting to grow and spread before either of these two developments. We know that the printing press created a greater demand for books, but to what extent was it also a response to greater demand for books? As we have seen, society in the late Middle Ages was becoming more complex. Commerce had been increasing ever since the Crusades. Towns were growing. Governments and bureaucracies were growing. All of these created a demand for more people who could read, keep records, manage, administrate, etc. Education was already changing before the Renaissance. Wills and inventories reveal that more people than just nobles and clerics possessed books and personal libraries. And lay people also had a surprising variety of books. Church and town records show that the number of schools were increasing quickly. Boys were being taught practical things like math, reading, and writing. Many girls were attending convent schools where they learned some reading and writing. Two prime examples of vernacular literature were the Divine Comedy by Dante, he wrote that from 1310 to 1320, and the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, he wrote that from 1387 to 1400. Both of these were in the vernacular. The Divine Comedy was in Italian, the Canterbury Tales was in Middle English. Both had religious underpinnings, that's a Middle Ages thing, but both also had much to say about secular society and cultural tensions, and that's a Renaissance thing. The Divine Comedy even had a classical writer, Virgil, in it as a character, and that's very much a Renaissance thing. Chaucer's characters were portrayed as materialistic and worldly, in other words, secular. And if you don't know what secular means, don't worry, we will spend much time on that term. And historians are highly dependent upon these and other works for information about late medieval society.